They assumed she was there for her husband's benefits. The way she sat quietly in the corner, wedding ring catching the harsh fluorescent light, clutching paperwork, with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to navigate military bureaucracy secondhand. The receptionist barely glanced up when she approached, automatically sliding the dependent spouse forms across the counter. "He deployed recently?" the woman asked with practiced sympathy, already reaching for the standard widow's benefit packet. But when the federal marshal walked through those doors 20 minutes later, took one look at that simple silver band, and stepped back in recognition, the entire room realized they'd made a devastating mistake. That wasn't just any wedding ring. And she wasn't just anyone's wife. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell had been staring at the same motivational poster for the better part of an hour. Service before self proclaimed bold letters above a stock photo of eagles soaring over mountain peaks, the kind of generic inspiration that decorated government buildings across America. The Fairfield County Veterans Services Center occupied a corner unit in an aging strip mall, sandwiched between Thompson's Tax Services and Myers Pharmacy, its existence announced only by a small placard that had weathered too many Ohio winters. The waiting area felt like a time capsule from 1995. Navy blue plastic chairs arranged in rigid rows, their surfaces worn smooth by countless hours of anxious waiting. Beige walls bore the stains of old water damage, and the carpet showed traffic patterns worn into permanent pathways. Overhead, fluorescent tubes hummed their eternal song, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made healthy people look sick and sick people look terminal. Sarah occupied chair number 7 in the third row, close enough to hear conversations at the processing windows but far enough back to avoid immediate attention. She'd chosen this seat deliberately, the way she chose everything deliberately, with an awareness of sight lines and exit routes that had become second nature years ago. Her khaki canvas jacket hung loose over a simple black sweater, both chosen for their unremarkable quality, their ability to help her blend into crowds of suburban wives and mothers running Tuesday afternoon errands. The paperwork in her lap represented 3 weeks of careful preparation. VA Form 21-534 for survivor benefits, DD Form 1300 for casualty reporting, and a half-dozen supporting documents that told the story she needed to tell. Each page had been filled out in her careful handwriting, left-handed script that leaned slightly backward, the product of countless forms completed in less than ideal conditions over the years. Her wedding ring, a simple silver band worn thin in places, caught the light as she turned each page, checking once more for completeness. Janet Walsh staffed the main reception desk with the weary efficiency of someone who'd processed too many tragedies to be surprised by new ones. 15 years of working with military families had taught her to read the subtle signs of grief, to recognize the particular way military widows carried themselves in the months after notification. The young woman in chair 7 fit the pattern perfectly. Quiet, composed, dressed in the kind of careful neutrals that suggested someone still learning how to shop for herself instead of around a husband's uniform requirements. "Next," Janet called, though her voice carried the softness reserved for presumed widows. Sarah approached the window with measured steps, her movements economical and precise. She placed her paperwork in the pass-through slot with both hands, a gesture that spoke of respect for official processes. Janet accepted the documents with practiced sympathy, her eyes automatically cataloging the details that would help her provide appropriate support. Young widow, probably early 30s based on appearance. Clean paperwork, which suggested either good preparation or military family experience. Wedding ring still worn, which indicated recent loss rather than long-term adjustment. "I'm sorry for your loss, honey," Janet said, her voice carrying 15 years of genuine compassion. "How long has it been?" Sarah's pause lasted exactly 2 heartbeats longer than natural conversation required. 6 months, she replied, her voice steady but quiet. The answer wasn't a lie, exactly, but it wasn't the complete truth either. Janet nodded with understanding that came from experience. 6 months was still raw, still in that terrible period where the reality of loss hadn't fully settled into acceptance. She'd seen hundreds of women in this exact situation, each carrying their grief differently, but all sharing that particular quality of careful composure that came from knowing that falling apart wasn't an option when paperwork needed to be completed and benefits needed to be secured. "Let me get you started with Tom," Janet said, indicating a young man at processing window number 2. "He's our benefits specialist for survivor claims. He'll take good care of you." Tom Bradley represented everything that was both right and wrong with modern bureaucracy. Fresh out of college with a degree in public administration, he'd taken this job with genuine intentions of helping veterans and their families navigate the complex web of federal benefits. But 6 months on the job had taught him that good intentions couldn't substitute for experience, and that the gap between classroom theory and real-world application was measured in human frustration rather than academic grades. He looked up as Sarah approached his window, automatically categorizing her as another routine survivor claim. Young military wife, husband probably died in training accident or overseas incident, now trying to figure out how to rebuild her life around government benefits and survivor support programs. He'd processed dozens of similar cases, each following predictable patterns that made the work both easier and harder than he'd expected. "Good afternoon, ma'am," Tom said, accepting her paperwork with practiced efficiency. "I see you're filing for survivor benefits. Let me pull up your husband's service record, and we'll get this sorted out for you." Sarah watched him navigate through database screens with the methodical clicking of someone following established procedures. His keyboard techniques suggested comfort with the system, but his occasional pauses and frowns indicated he was encountering something unexpected. "I'm showing some inconsistencies in the records," Tom said after several minutes of searching. "What was your husband's unit designation during his final deployment?" The question hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Sarah's response came with the same careful timing as before, measured and precise. "That information was classified." Tom's eyebrows rose slightly. Classified deployments weren't unusual, but they required different paperwork protocols and verification procedures that he'd been trained on but never actually implemented. "Okay, that makes sense. Let me access the restricted records database. Do you have his clearance authorization codes?" "Those weren't provided to me." The answer struck Tom as odd. Military wives typically received comprehensive briefings about their husbands' benefits and paperwork requirements, especially for classified operations where normal documentation procedures didn't apply. But grief affected people differently, and memory gaps weren't unusual in the months following loss. Behind Sarah, the waiting area had filled with the usual Tuesday afternoon crowd. Mike Chen sat 3 chairs back, a veteran of 2 Iraq deployments who developed strong opinions about military benefits and who deserved them. His conversation with the elderly man beside him carried clearly through the acoustic gaps in the room's outdated construction. "Problem with these young wives," Mike said, not bothering to lower his voice, "is they think marrying a soldier makes them part of the military. Come in here expecting benefits they never earned themselves." His companion, a Korean War veteran named Robert Haynes, made a non-committal sound that could have indicated agreement or simply acknowledgement that Mike was talking. Robert had learned over 72 years that some conversations were best avoided, especially in government buildings where emotions ran high and patience ran low. "I served 8 years active duty," Mike continued, warming to his theme. "Saw real combat, earned every benefit I get. But these military wives show up with paperwork and sad stories, thinking that entitles them to the same treatment as actual veterans." Sarah's shoulders didn't tense. Her posture didn't change. But something shifted in the quality of her stillness. The way a cat's attention focuses without visible movement when it detects a sound too subtle for human hearing. Tom had moved to consultation with his supervisor, a conversation conducted in whispers that weren't quite as private as they imagined. The supervisor, a woman named Carol Peterson with 20 years of VA experience, leaned over Tom's shoulder to examine the computer screen. "No record of the unit she's referencing," Carol said quietly, "and the casualty report doesn't match standard format for overseas deaths." "Maybe it's still being processed?" Tom suggested. Classified operations sometimes take months to work through proper channels. Carol's expression suggested she'd heard similar explanations before, usually from people whose paperwork didn't quite add up for reasons that became clear only after extensive investigation. "Pull up the dependent verification system. Let's confirm her status before we process anything." The dependent verification system was designed to prevent fraud by cross-referencing military marriages with official personnel records. It was a necessary precaution, but one that often caught legitimate survivors in bureaucratic delays during the worst periods of their lives. Sarah watched the consultation through the reinforced glass, reading body language and lip movements with the unconscious skill of someone who'd learned to gather information without appearing to do so. She could see the doubt creeping into their expressions, the subtle shift from sympathy to suspicion that accompanied questions about authenticity. Detective Rick Santos chose that moment to make his afternoon rounds through the building. As the designated law enforcement liaison for the Veterans Center, he was supposed to provide security and assistance for any situations that exceeded normal administrative procedures. In practice, this meant he spent most of his time drinking coffee and chatting with staff members who appreciated having someone in uniform around to handle the occasional difficult client. Rick was 43 years old, with the soft build of someone who'd spent more years behind a desk than in the field. His badge carried the authority of Cedar Falls Police Department, but his experience consisted mainly of domestic disputes, property crime investigations, and the kind of routine law enforcement work that kept small Ohio cities functioning without making headlines. He noticed Sarah immediately, partly because she was younger than most Veterans Center clients, but mainly because something about her stillness struck him as unusual. Military wives, in his experience, tended toward nervous energy during benefit applications, the kind of barely contained anxiety that came from trying to navigate complex systems while dealing with loss. This woman sat like she was waiting for a dentist appointment, rather than filing for survival benefits. "Afternoon, Janet," Rick said, approaching the reception desk with the casual authority of someone comfortable in his territory. "Everything running smooth today?" "Mostly," Janet replied, glancing toward Tom's window where the consultation with Carol was becoming more animated. "Got a potential verification issue at window 2. Young military wife, but her husband's records aren't showing up in standard databases." Rick's attention.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Sharpened slightly. Verification issues could indicate fraud, which would require police involvement and extensive paperwork that he'd rather avoid on a Tuesday afternoon. But they could also indicate legitimate cases caught in bureaucratic gaps, which required patience and additional investigation rather than law enforcement intervention. "Want me to take a look?" he offered, already moving toward Tom's window. Sarah became aware of his approach without turning around, the way prey animals sense predators through peripheral vision and subtle changes in environmental sound. She'd been in too many situations where authority figures asked questions that had no good answers to be comfortable with unsolicited law enforcement attention. Rick positioned himself where he could observe both Sarah and Tom's computer screen, close enough to project authority but not so close as to appear overtly intimidating. "Problem with the application?" Tom looked up with the relief of someone grateful for backup. "We're having trouble verifying her husband's service record. She says he was in a classified unit, but we're not finding any documentation that matches her claim." Rick studied Sarah's profile, noting the way she kept her attention focused forward rather than acknowledging his presence. "What unit was your husband assigned to, ma'am?" The question carried more weight than curiosity. Rick's tone suggested this was an official inquiry rather than casual conversation, the kind of question that required accurate answers and had consequences for evasion. Sarah turned to face him with the same measured movement she'd used approaching the window. Her expression was polite, but neutral, revealing nothing beyond basic acknowledgement of his authority. "I'm not able to discuss operational details." The answer struck Rick as evasive. Military widows typically had extensive knowledge of their husband's service history, especially details relevant to benefit applications. Claims about classification and operational security often indicated someone trying to avoid questions they couldn't answer convincingly. "I understand operational security," Rick said, his voice taking on the patient but firm tone he used with uncooperative witnesses. "But we need some kind of verification for benefit applications. Maybe you have his dog tags or military ID that could help us confirm his service." Sarah's left hand moved almost imperceptibly, her thumb rotating the silver ring around her finger in a gesture so subtle it might have been unconscious. Personal effects were retained by his unit. Mike Chen's voice carried clearly from the waiting area, where his conversation about military benefits had evolved into a broader commentary on authenticity and earned versus inherited privilege. "See what I mean? Real veterans don't have trouble proving their service. We've got documentation going back decades, medals, discharge papers, medical records, but these wives show up with stories about classified this and confidential that, expecting us to take their word for everything. His commentary found a receptive audience in Robert Haynes, who nodded with the measured agreement of someone who'd seen similar patterns over the years. Different world now, Robert observed. Time was, military families knew their place in the system. Wives supported their husbands, handled the home front, but they didn't pretend to be soldiers themselves. Sarah's thumb continued its rotation around the silver band, a nervous habit that seemed at odds with her otherwise controlled demeanor. The ring itself was unremarkable, the kind of simple wedding band that could be purchased at any jewelry store for under $200. But there was something about the way she wore it, the unconscious familiarity of the gesture, that suggested it carried meaning beyond its monetary value. Rick noticed the ring movement and interpreted it as a sign of nervousness, possibly guilt. "Mind if I take a look at that ring, ma'am?" Sometimes military jewelry has unit markings that can help with verification. The request crossed a line from official inquiry into personal intrusion, but Rick's authority gave him latitude for questions that might be inappropriate in other contexts. Sarah's hesitation lasted exactly long enough to suggest reluctance without appearing uncooperative. She extended her left hand across the counter space between them, the ring catching fluorescent light as it moved through the air. Rick accepted her hand with the impersonal professionalism of someone accustomed to examining evidence, turning it slightly to get better light on the band's surface. The ring appeared completely ordinary under casual inspection. Simple silver band, slightly worn, no visible engravings or markings that would indicate military affiliation. Rick turned it slightly, looking for unit insignia or service markings that might have been worn smooth by years of wear. "Doesn't look like military issue," he concluded, releasing her hand. "Most service members get their wedding rings engraved with unit information or deployment dates. This looks like standard civilian jewelry." Tom had been watching the exchange while continuing his database searches, growing increasingly frustrated with the lack of verification options. "Ma'am, I'm going to need some kind of documentation before we can process your application. Maybe contact information for his commanding officer, or casualty notification paperwork from the unit." Sarah's response came with the same careful timing that had characterized all her answers. "That information isn't available to me." The phrase struck everyone within hearing range as deliberately evasive. Carol Peterson looked up from her desk with the sharp attention of someone who'd heard similar non-answers from people attempting benefit fraud. Mike Chen's conversation in the waiting area paused as he processed what he'd overheard. Even Janet Walsh began paying closer attention to the interaction at window 2. Rick's suspicion crystallized into action. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification, and any documentation you have related to your husband's death." The request transformed the situation from administrative inquiry to potential investigation. Sarah reached into her jacket pocket with deliberate slowness, extracting a state-issued driver's license that she handed to Rick without comment. "Sarah Mitchell," Rick read aloud, examining the card for signs of tampering or forgery. "Cedar Falls address, issued 3 years ago. Clean record as far as I can tell." He handed the license back and waited for additional documentation. Sarah extracted a folded paper from her envelope, handling it with the care reserved for important documents. The casualty notification letter bore official letterhead and signatures, but Rick's examination revealed inconsistencies that raised additional questions. "This notification doesn't include unit designation or cause of death," Rick observed. "Just says he was killed in the line of duty during classified operations." That's pretty vague for official military correspondence. Tom leaned forward to examine the letter through his window. Most casualty notifications include detailed information for benefit processing. This looks more like a preliminary notification than final documentation. The observation hung in the air like an accusation. Preliminary notifications were typically followed by comprehensive paperwork packages that included all the information necessary for survivors to apply for benefits. The absence of follow-up documentation suggested either bureaucratic delays or potential fraud. Carol Peterson approached Tom's window with the purposeful stride of someone prepared to resolve the situation definitively. "Ma'am, I've been processing military benefits for 20 years, and I've never seen a case where we couldn't verify basic service information. Either your husband's records are so highly classified that they exceed our clearance levels, or there's something wrong with your application." The statement drew attention from throughout the waiting area. Other clients looked up from their paperwork and magazines, sensing the tension that accompanied official challenges to someone's credibility. Mike Chen abandoned his conversation entirely, focusing his attention on the interaction at window 2 with the eager interest of someone watching a situation validate his preconceptions. Sarah's response came with the same measured calm she'd maintained throughout the encounter. "I understand your position." The acknowledgement without explanation struck Carol as confirmation of her suspicions. "I'm going to have to suspend processing on this application until we can obtain proper verification. You'll need to contact your husband's unit directly and get documentation that meets our standards." Rick nodded approvingly. "That seems reasonable." "Ma'am, if you're having trouble getting the right paperwork, there are victim assistance programs that can help military families navigate the system. But we can't process benefits without proper documentation." The conversation had attracted the attention of Lisa Parker, a county clerk who handled veteran disability claims from an adjacent desk. She'd been listening with growing confusion to an exchange that didn't match her 15 years of experience with military families. "Excuse me," Lisa interjected, approaching Tom's window. "Did you say her husband was killed in classified operations 6 months ago?" Sarah's attention shifted to Lisa with the focused intensity of someone evaluating a new variable in a complex equation. Yes, Lisa's expression suggested she'd identified a significant problem. "Ma'am, I process casualty benefits for 3 counties, and I haven't seen any notifications for classified operation deaths in the past year. Those cases require special handling and interagency coordination. I would have been involved in the paperwork." The observation struck the assembled group like a physical blow. If Lisa was correct, then Sarah's entire application was based on false premises. Either her husband hadn't died in classified operations, or he hadn't died at all. Mike Chen rose from his chair and approached the processing area with the confident stride of someone prepared to expose fraud. "I told you something wasn't right about this. Real military wives don't have trouble proving their husband's service. They've got boxes of paperwork, photographs in uniform, letters from commanding officers. This woman shows up with vague stories and no documentation, expecting us to take her word for everything." His words found support among other waiting clients who'd been listening to the exchange with growing skepticism. The mood in the room shifted from sympathetic support for a grieving widow to suspicious evaluation of someone whose story wasn't adding up. Rick felt the situation escalating beyond administrative inquiry into potential criminal investigation. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me for some additional questions. We need to verify your identity and the accuracy of your application before we can proceed." Sarah's thumb resumed its rotation around the silver ring, the gesture more pronounced now as stress began to penetrate her controlled exterior. She'd been in similar situations before, moments when cover stories began unraveling and extraction became necessary. But this was different. This wasn't an operation with planned escape routes and backup support. This was civilian life, where the consequences of exposure couldn't be managed through tactical withdrawal. The main entrance opened with a pneumatic sigh, admitting a woman in her early 40s wearing the crisp uniform of a federal marshal. Elena Rodriguez carried herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command situations, her presence immediately shifting the atmosphere in the room from bureaucratic tension to official law enforcement attention. Elena's entrance wasn't coincidental. She'd been conducting routine liaison visits to veteran service centers throughout the district, part of an ongoing federal program to improve coordination between local agencies and federal law enforcement. But her attention was immediately drawn to the situation developing at window 2, where a group of people appeared to be confronting a young woman who sat with the particular stillness Elena recognized from her own operational experience. She approached the processing area with measured steps, her trained eye cataloging details that others might miss. The woman at the center of attention sat like someone accustomed to maintaining composure under pressure, her posture suggesting military training rather than civilian distress. The silver ring on her left hand caught Elena's attention not for its appearance, but for the way the woman wore it, the unconscious familiarity that indicated years of habit rather than recent acquisition. "Everything all right here?" Elena asked, her voice carrying the neutral authority of someone prepared to mediate or investigate as circumstances required. Rick straightened slightly in recognition of federal authority. "Marshal Rodriguez, we've got a potential benefit fraud situation. This woman claims her husband was killed in classified military operations, but we can't verify any of her documentation." Elena's attention focused on Sarah with the intensity of someone processing multiple streams of information simultaneously. Something about the woman's appearance struck her as familiar, though she couldn't immediately place the context. The controlled stillness, the way she held her head, the particular quality of attention she brought to her surroundings, these details suggested someone with training that extended beyond civilian experience. "May I see your identification, ma'am?" Elena requested, her tone professional but not accusatory. Sarah handed over her driver's license with the same careful precision she'd used throughout the encounter. Elena examined it thoroughly, noting details that others had missed. The address corresponded to a part of Cedar Falls that housed several military families. The issue date coincided with the timing of someone establishing new civilian identity. Most importantly, the photograph showed someone who looked comfortable with official documentation rather than nervous about scrutiny. "Sarah Mitchell," Elena read aloud, then looked up to meet Sarah's eyes directly. "Have we met before?" The question carried weight beyond casual inquiry. Elena's tone suggested recognition rather than confusion, the kind of professional memory that came from encounters in official rather than social contexts. Sarah's response came with fractional hesitation. "I don't think so." Elena continued her examination of the driver's license, but her attention was drawn to the silver ring on Sarah's extended hand. Under the harsh fluorescent lighting of the Veterans Center, she could see something that others had missed. A faint pattern etched into the inner surface of the band, visible only when light struck it at specific angles. "Interesting ring," Elena observed, her voice carrying subtle emphasis that suggested deeper meaning. "May I take a closer look?" The request transformed the atmosphere in the room. Elena's tone indicated this wasn't casual curiosity, but professional interest, the kind of attention that preceded significant developments in federal investigations. Sarah extended her hand across the space between them, the same gesture she'd made for Rick but with different implications. Elena accepted her hand with the careful attention of someone examining evidence, turning the ring slightly to catch light at the optimal angle. Under Elena's trained examination, the ring revealed details that casual inspection had missed. Etched into the inner surface of the band, so finely crafted that it was nearly invisible without proper lighting, was a symbol that made Elena's breath catch in recognition. The etching showed a small triangle containing what appeared to be crosshairs, surrounded by lettering so minute it required close examination to decipher. Elena had seen similar markings before, in classified briefings and operational reports that carried security classifications above her clearance level. "Where did you get this ring?" Elena asked, her voice dropping to the careful tone used for questions that had significant implications. Sarah's thumb resumed its rotation around the band, the gesture more pronounced as she processed Elena's obvious recognition of something others had missed. It was custom-made. The answer was technically accurate but deliberately incomplete, the kind of response that provided information without revealing operational details. Elena recognized the pattern from her own experience with classified briefings and need-to-know protocols. Elena's examination of the ring continued with growing understanding. The symbol etched into the inner surface wasn't random jewelry decoration. It was a unit identification marker, the kind used by operational teams whose existence couldn't be acknowledged through normal military channels. The triangle and crosshairs design indicated reconnaissance and target acquisition specialty. The surrounding text, barely visible even under direct examination, included alphanumeric codes that Elena recognized from classified operational briefings. This wasn't military jewelry purchased at a base exchange or ordered from a catalog. This was authentic operational identification, the kind issued to personnel whose missions required absolute security. "Ma'am," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying a tone that cut through the ambient noise of the Veterans Center and commanded absolute attention. "I need to ask you about the Widowmaker designation." The question struck the room like a physical blow. Sarah's controlled composure finally showed cracks, her eyes meeting Elena's with an intensity that confirmed recognition and understanding. The name carried implications that extended far beyond casual military knowledge. Rick looked confused. "Marshal, what's the Widowmaker designation?" Elena didn't answer immediately. Instead, she continued her examination of the ring while processing the implications of what she'd discovered. The Widowmaker unit was mentioned in classified briefings as a deep reconnaissance team specializing in target acquisition and elimination in denied territory. Personnel assigned to the unit were officially listed as killed in action to protect their operational security, allowing them to function without the vulnerabilities that came with official existence. If Sarah Mitchell was carrying authentic Widowmaker identification, then everything about the afternoon's interaction had been based on false assumptions. She wasn't a military wife seeking survivor benefits. She was an operational asset whose official status as deceased provided cover for continued missions. "Ma'am," Elena said, her voice carrying the weight of official recognition. "I think we need to have a private conversation." The private conversation Elena Rodriguez requested never materialized. Before she could guide Sarah away from the increasingly hostile crowd, Tom Bradley's supervisor made a decision that transformed administrative skepticism into public confrontation. Carol Peterson stepped forward with the authority of 20 years in veteran services, her voice carrying clearly through the acoustically challenged space. "I'm sorry, Marshal Rodriguez, but we can't allow private consultations until this application has been properly vetted through official channels. If this woman has legitimate claims, they need to be verified through standard protocols, not backdoor conversations with federal law enforcement." Carol's intervention wasn't motivated by malice, but by years of experience with benefit fraud that had made her protective of the system's integrity. She'd seen too many cases where sympathetic officials had bypassed verification procedures, only to discover later that taxpayer money had been diverted to ineligible recipients. Her responsibility was to the legitimate veterans and families who depended on properly administered benefits, not to individuals whose stories couldn't withstand basic scrutiny. Elena found herself in the uncomfortable position of recognizing classified information while being unable to reveal the basis for her recognition. The Widowmaker unit's existence was compartmentalized at levels that exceeded her official clearance, known to her only through peripheral involvement in interagency coordination meetings. She couldn't explain why the ring's markings were significant without compromising operational security that protected active missions. "Mrs. Peterson, I understand your concerns about proper procedures," Elena said carefully, "but there may be federal jurisdiction issues that require immediate attention." The suggestion of federal involvement struck Carol as confirmation of her suspicions rather than validation of Sarah's claims. In her experience, legitimate military benefits rarely involved federal marshals, and the suggestion of jurisdiction issues often indicated fraud investigations rather than routine claim processing. "If there are federal jurisdiction issues," Carol replied with bureaucratic precision, "then this application should be transferred to appropriate federal agencies rather than processed through county veterans services. We're not equipped to handle cases that exceed our clearance levels." Mike Chen had been listening to the exchange with growing satisfaction, interpreting the bureaucratic resistance as vindication of his earlier skepticism. He approached the processing area with the confidence of someone whose expertise had been validated by official recognition. "Marshal, if I may," Mike interjected, "I've been watching this situation develop, and nothing about this woman's story adds up. Real military families don't have trouble proving their status. We've got documentation for everything: service records, deployment orders, casualty notifications. But she shows up with vague claims about classified operations and expects us to take her word for everything." His commentary found support among other veterans in the waiting area, who nodded with the solidarity of people whose own benefit applications had required extensive documentation and verification. The suggestion that someone could bypass these requirements through claims of classification struck them as fundamentally unfair to those who had followed proper procedures. Robert Haynes rose from his seat with the careful dignity of someone whose age commanded respect, but whose opinions carried weight earned through experience. "Son," he said to Mike, though his words were directed toward the entire room, "I've been dealing with military bureaucracy since before you were born. Served in Korea when classification meant something different than it does now. But I'll tell you this: legitimate operations leave paper trails, even classified ones. Might take months or years to declassify, but the documentation exists." His observation carried particular authority because of his age and obvious veteran status. Robert's presence in the Veterans Center wasn't for benefit applications. At his age, his military benefits had been established for decades. He was there accompanying his grandson through disability claim processing, lending moral support and institutional knowledge to someone navigating the system for the first time. "That's exactly my point," Mike continued, emboldened by Robert's tacit support. If her husband really died in some kind of classified operation, there would be federal caseworkers assigned to help with benefits. There would be special procedures and dedicated points of contact. But she's here filing paperwork like any other widow, claiming we should make exceptions because her story is too secret to verify. Sarah had remained silent throughout the increasingly aggressive questioning, her attention focused on Elena Rodriguez with the intensity of someone calculating options and possibilities. The federal marshal's recognition of the ring's significance suggested knowledge that exceeded normal law enforcement briefings, but Elena's inability to act on that knowledge indicated constraints that Sarah understood from her own operational experience. Detective Rick Santos interpreted Sarah's silence as confirmation of guilt rather than operational discipline. In his experience, innocent people defended themselves vigorously when questioned, while guilty parties often withdrew into non-cooperation when their stories began unraveling. "Ma'am," Rick said, his voice taking on the formal tone he used when transitioning from investigation to arrest procedures, "I'm going to need you to come down to the station for additional questioning. We need to verify your identity and investigate potential benefit fraud before this situation goes any further." The threat of arrest transformed the atmosphere in the room, from skeptical inquiry to active confrontation. Other clients in the waiting area stopped pretending to mind their own business, focusing their full attention on what appeared to be the exposure of someone attempting to defraud the veteran benefits system. Lisa Parker approached from her adjacent workstation, carrying a folder of documents that she'd been reviewing during the confrontation. "Detective Santos, I've been checking our interagency notifications for the past year, and I haven't found any records of casualty benefits being processed for classified operations deaths. If this woman's husband really died in the kind of mission she's describing, there would have been federal coordination with our office." Her statement carried particular weight because of her administrative role in processing complex benefit claims. Lisa's responsibilities included liaison work with federal agencies when cases exceeded county jurisdiction, giving her knowledge of procedures that applied to unusual circumstances. "That settles it," Carol Peterson declared with the finality of someone closing a case file. "Ma'am, I'm suspending all processing on your application and forwarding this matter to our fraud investigation unit. Detective Santos, she's all yours." Elena Rodriguez found herself watching the systematic destruction of someone's credibility while being unable to intervene effectively. Her recognition of the ring's significance was based on classified briefings that she couldn't reference without compromising ongoing operations. But her operational instincts, honed through years of federal law enforcement, suggested that Sarah Mitchell was exactly who her identification claimed her to be, just not in the way anyone in the room understood. Sarah rose from her chair with the fluid precision of someone whose movements had been trained for efficiency under stress. She gathered her paperwork with methodical care, folding each document along existing creases and returning them to their envelope with practiced organization. Her actions suggested someone preparing for tactical withdrawal rather than someone panicking under accusation. "Detective Santos," Sarah said, her voice carrying the same measured calm that had characterized all her responses. "I understand your position, but I'm not going to answer questions without legal representation." The assertion of constitutional rights struck Mike Chen as confirmation of guilt. "There it is," he announced to the room. Innocent people don't lawyer up when asked simple questions about their husband's military service. She knows her story won't hold up under real investigation. His interpretation found support among the gathered veterans, who murmured agreement based on their own experience with law enforcement interactions. In their world, cooperation with authorities was considered a civic duty, and claims of rights were often interpreted as admission of wrongdoing. Rick Santos recognized the shift from voluntary cooperation to formal investigation, with all the procedural requirements that entailed. "Ma'am, you have the right to remain silent, and you have the right to an attorney, but I want you to understand that leaving without answering questions is going to be interpreted as non-cooperation with a fraud investigation." Elena stepped forward with the careful authority of someone navigating jurisdictional complexities. "Detective Santos, before you proceed with any arrest, I need to verify federal interest in this case. There may be circumstances that require coordination with other agencies." Her intervention wasn't based on clear authority, but on procedural knowledge that allowed federal marshals to pause local investigations when potential federal crimes were involved. Elena was buying time to contact superiors who might have clearance to address the widowmaker identification without compromising ongoing operations. "Marshal Rodriguez?" Rick replied with the patient tone of someone explaining obvious procedures. "If there's federal jurisdiction, you're welcome to take over the investigation. But I can't let a potential fraud suspect walk away, just because she might be involved in something that exceeds local authority." The standoff between federal and local law enforcement created a moment of uncertainty that Sarah recognized as an opportunity. Her operational training had prepared her for situations where extraction required careful timing and situational awareness rather than dramatic action. "I'm leaving now," Sarah announced, her voice cutting through the bureaucratic debate with quiet authority. "If Detective Santos wants to arrest me, he can explain to his superiors why he detained a federal asset without proper clearance verification." The statement struck the room like a physical blow. Sarah's use of the term federal asset suggested knowledge and status that exceeded anything she'd previously claimed. The casual way she referenced clearance verification indicated familiarity with classification systems that most civilians never encountered. Mike Chen's confidence faltered for the first time since the confrontation began. What did she just say, federal asset? Tom Bradley looked up from his computer screen with the confused expression of someone whose training manual didn't include procedures for situations involving federal assets with classification issues. Should I be documenting this somehow? Carol Peterson felt her bureaucratic certainty beginning to crack under the weight of implications she didn't fully understand. 20 years of experience had taught her to recognize when situations exceeded her knowledge base, and the terminology Sarah had used suggested complexities that extended far beyond routine benefit fraud. Elena Rodriguez seized the moment of uncertainty to assert federal authority. "Detective Santos, I'm requesting that you delay any enforcement action until I can verify this individual's status through appropriate federal channels. There may be national security implications that require different handling procedures." Her request carried the weight of interagency cooperation protocols that local law enforcement was required to respect, even when the specific justifications weren't immediately clear. Rick found himself in the uncomfortable position of choosing between proceeding with an investigation that might interfere with federal operations or allowing a potential fraud suspect to leave without resolution. Sarah used the bureaucratic confusion to complete her withdrawal from the situation. She moved toward the exit with purposeful steps, her posture suggesting someone who expected her path to remain clear rather than someone fleeing from authorities. "Ma'am, wait," Tom called from his processing window, suddenly concerned about the administrative implications of an unresolved application. "What should I do with your benefit application?" Sarah paused at the door, her hand resting on the handle as she considered her response. The question represented everything that was both right and wrong with the system she'd been trying to navigate. Bureaucratic procedures demanded completion and resolution, but operational realities often required ambiguity and misdirection. "File it under pending federal review," she replied, using terminology that sounded official without committing to any specific follow-up procedures. The answer satisfied Tom's need for administrative closure, while creating enough uncertainty to prevent immediate action by others in the room. Sarah understood bureaucratic psychology well enough to know that vague references to federal oversight would discourage local initiative, while providing time for situations to resolve themselves through official channels. Detective Rick Santos found himself caught between conflicting responsibilities. His training demanded that he pursue potential fraud investigations to their logical conclusion, but his experience with interagency cooperation warned him against interfering with federal operations that he didn't fully understand. "Marshal Rodriguez," Rick said, seeking guidance that would allow him to fulfill his responsibilities without creating jurisdictional conflicts. "I need some kind of official statement about federal interest in this case. I can't just let someone walk away from a fraud investigation based on vague claims about national security." Elena understood Rick's position, but her own authority was limited by classification constraints that prevented her from providing the explanations he needed. The Widowmaker unit's existence was compartmentalized at levels that exceeded her clearance, known to her only through operational briefings that she couldn't reference without compromising ongoing missions. "Detective, I'll provide you with appropriate documentation through official channels within 24 hours, Elena replied, using the standard bureaucratic timeline that allowed federal agencies to coordinate responses without appearing to obstruct local law enforcement. Sarah took advantage of the ongoing jurisdictional discussion to complete her exit from the Veterans Center. The door closed behind her with the pneumatic sigh of institutional finality, leaving behind a room full of people who were struggling to process what they'd witnessed. The silence that followed her departure carried weight that exceeded simple absence. Everyone in the room understood that they'd been part of something significant, but nobody was entirely certain what that something had been. The comfortable assumptions that had guided their initial interactions had been replaced by questions that none of them were qualified to answer. Mike Chen was the first to break the silence, though his voice lacked the confident authority that had characterized his earlier commentary. What just happened here? The question hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished fire, filling the space with implications that nobody was prepared to address directly. Tom Bradley stared at his computer screen as if it might provide answers to questions that extended beyond his training and experience. Carol Peterson shuffled paperwork with the mechanical precision of someone seeking comfort in familiar procedures. Robert Haynes settled back into his chair with the careful movements of someone whose age had taught him to recognize when situations exceeded his understanding. 72 years of life had shown him the difference between mysteries that could be solved through investigation and mysteries that were best left to people with appropriate authority and clearance. "Son," Robert said to Mike, his voice carrying the wisdom of experience, "sometimes the best thing you can do is mind your own business and let people who know what they're doing handle things that are beyond your pay grade." Lisa Parker returned to her workstation with the focused attention of someone seeking refuge in routine administrative tasks. Her responsibilities included processing complex benefit claims, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for situations involving federal assets and classification issues that exceeded county jurisdiction. Elena Rodriguez remained in the Veterans Center long enough to complete her official liaison visit, but her attention was divided between routine administrative duties and the complex implications of what she'd witnessed. The ring's markings had been unmistakable to someone with her briefing background, but her ability to act on that recognition was constrained by operational security requirements that protected ongoing missions. She made a mental note to contact her superiors through appropriate channels, using communication protocols that allowed federal agencies to coordinate responses without compromising classified operations. The Widowmaker unit's existence was compartmentalized for reasons that extended beyond simple security classification, and Elena understood that her recognition of Sarah Mitchell's status came with responsibilities that exceeded her current authority. Outside in the strip mall parking lot, Sarah Mitchell sat in her decade-old sedan for several minutes before starting the engine. The afternoon's events had unfolded exactly as her operational training had prepared her to expect. Civilian bureaucracies operated according to procedures that assumed transparency and verification, creating inevitable conflicts when operational requirements demanded ambiguity and misdirection. She removed the silver ring from her finger and examined it under natural light, noting details that fluorescent lighting had obscured. The microscopic etching remained invisible to casual inspection, but direct sunlight revealed the intricate craftsmanship that had gone into creating identification that could withstand scrutiny while remaining functionally invisible. The Widowmaker designation wasn't something she'd requested or aspired to earn. It had been assigned based on operational necessity and demonstrated capability, marking her as someone whose official existence had been terminated to provide cover for missions that required absolute deniability. The ring served as both identification and memorial, acknowledging service that could never be publicly recognized. Sarah understood that her attempt to access survivor benefits had been doomed from the beginning. The operational requirements that protected her missions also prevented her from accessing the civilian support systems designed for military families. She existed in the space between official recognition and operational necessity, protected by classification that also isolated her from normal institutional support. She started the engine and drove away from the Veterans Center, leaving behind a group of people who would spend weeks trying to understand what they'd witnessed. The bureaucratic machinery would continue its grinding work, processing applications and verifying claims according to established procedures that assumed transparency and accountability. But some stories lived exclusively in the spaces between official procedures, protected by classification that served purposes beyond simple security. Some people served in ways that couldn't be acknowledged without compromising the missions that justified their sacrifice. And some recognition could only come from those who understood the true cost of operations that official records would never acknowledge. The strip mall returned to its normal rhythm of Tuesday afternoon commerce. Traffic moved with the steady flow of people completing routine errands and managing ordinary responsibilities. Life continued its predictable patterns, unchanged by the recognition that had occurred in a bureaucratic waiting room where assumptions had collided with operational reality. Inside the Veterans Center, The afternoon's lesson began its transformation from witnessed event to shared memory. Not the kind of story that would end up in official reports or featured in training materials, but the kind that would influence how people treated the next quiet individual who appeared with credentials that didn't fit standard verification procedures. Tom Bradley would spend the evening researching terms he'd heard but didn't understand, looking for information that existed only in classified databases and operational memories. He'd learned that some documentation lived exclusively in systems that exceeded his clearance level, and that verification procedures sometimes encountered cases that challenged fundamental assumptions about transparency and accountability. Carol Peterson would review her procedures manual, seeking guidance for situations involving federal assets and classification issues that exceeded county jurisdiction. 20 years of experience had taught her to recognize when cases required different handling protocols, but nothing in her training had prepared her for the intersection of routine benefit applications and operational security requirements. Detective Rick Santos would file a report that captured the basic facts of the encounter while avoiding speculation about federal jurisdiction issues that exceeded his understanding. His experience with interagency cooperation had taught him to recognize when situations required coordination with authorities who possessed knowledge and clearance that he lacked. The lesson wasn't just about Sarah Mitchell or the Widowmaker unit. It was about the invisible infrastructure of service that operated in spaces between official recognition and operational necessity. About people who served in ways that couldn't be acknowledged without compromising the missions that justified their sacrifice. About the difference between civilian assumptions and operational realities that shaped the world in ways that most people would never fully comprehend. Marshal Elena Rodriguez would submit her report through classified channels, using communication protocols that allowed federal agencies to coordinate responses without compromising ongoing operations. Her recognition of Sarah's status came with responsibilities that exceeded her current authority, but she understood the importance of ensuring that appropriate people were informed about situations that might require different handling procedures. The story would live in the memories of everyone who'd witnessed it, but it would never be told in ways that compromised the operational security that protected ongoing missions. Some recognition came through demonstration rather than explanation, and some respect was earned through service that could never be fully acknowledged. And somewhere in the evening traffic of Cedar Falls, Ohio, a woman drove home carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd maintained operational discipline under pressure, completed her mission parameters despite bureaucratic obstacles, and reminded a room full of strangers that service sometimes required sacrifices that extended beyond public recognition. The silver ring remained in her jacket pocket, faded and unremarkable to casual observation, carrying the weight of operations that would never be declassified and service that would never be fully acknowledged. But for one afternoon, in one bureaucratic waiting room, its meaning had been recognized by someone who understood that heroes don't always fit the patterns that civilian institutions expect them to follow. The 24 hours that followed Sarah Mitchell's departure from the Fairfield County Veterans Services Center created ripple effects that extended far beyond the strip mall where the confrontation had occurred. Elena Rodriguez spent most of that time navigating the complex bureaucracy of federal agencies, trying to obtain clearance for information that existed in classification levels above her normal access. Her first call went to her immediate supervisor at the Federal Marshal Service, Deputy Chief Marcus Webb, who listened to her account with the patient attention of someone accustomed to unusual situations. Webb's 15 years of federal law enforcement had taught him to recognize when routine operations intersected with classified matters that required careful handling. Rodriguez, Webb said after Elena finished her report, "You're telling me you think this woman is connected to a unit that officially doesn't exist, based on markings on a wedding ring that you couldn't photograph or document because of operational security concerns." Elena understood how her report sounded to someone without her briefing background. "Sir, the markings were consistent with operational identification that I've seen in classified interagency briefings. The woman's behavior and responses suggested training that exceeded normal civilian experience." Webb's silence stretched long enough to suggest he was consulting resources beyond Elena's immediate knowledge. When he spoke again, his tone carried the careful weight of someone choosing words with consideration for their broader implications. "I'm going to connect you with someone from the Defense Intelligence Agency. This conversation never happened through official channels, and you're going to forget any specifics about unit designations or operational identifiers. Understood?" The warning wasn't unexpected, but it confirmed Elena's suspicion that her recognition of the ring's significance had connected her to something that existed well beyond normal law enforcement jurisdiction. She spent the next 6 hours in a secure communication facility, participating in briefings that required security clearances she'd never known she possessed. Meanwhile, Detective Rick Santos found himself dealing with pressure from multiple directions as word of the Veterans Center incident spread through law enforcement channels. His captain, Joseph Martinez, had received inquiries from federal agencies that suggested the case involved complexities that exceeded normal fraud investigation procedures. Santos, Captain Martinez said, calling Rick into his office Wednesday morning, "I need you to explain why I'm getting calls from people who won't identify their agencies, asking about a benefit fraud case that apparently involves national security implications." Rick had spent most of the previous evening writing and rewriting his incident report, trying to capture the facts of the encounter without speculating about federal jurisdiction issues that he didn't understand. "Captain, the woman claimed to be a federal asset when I attempted to detain her for questioning. Marshal Rodriguez requested that I delay enforcement action pending federal review." Martinez reviewed Rick's report with the careful attention of someone looking for details that might explain why a routine fraud investigation had attracted federal attention. 23 years of police work had taught him to recognize when local cases intersected with federal operations that required different handling procedures. The woman just walked away. No arrest, no further questioning, no attempt to verify her claims. Rick felt defensive about decisions that had seemed reasonable at the time but appeared questionable in retrospect. "Sir, Marshal Rodriguez indicated federal jurisdiction, and the woman's knowledge of classification procedures suggested she might be legitimate. I didn't want to interfere with federal operations without clear authority." Martinez set down the report and looked at Rick with the expression of someone trying to balance competing responsibilities. "Santos, I'm going to tell you something that doesn't leave this office. I've been instructed to close this case and refer any future inquiries to federal channels. No follow-up investigation, no additional paperwork, no discussion with media or other agencies." The instruction struck Rick as confirmation that his decision to avoid confrontation had been correct. But it also raised questions about what kind of operation could generate that level of federal protection. In his experience, routine law enforcement cases didn't disappear into classification levels that prevented normal police work. Back at the Veterans Center, Tom Bradley was discovering that administrative curiosity could create its own complications. His attempts to research the terminology Sarah Mitchell had used led him into databases and reference materials that required clearances he didn't possess. "Tom," Carol Peterson said, approaching his workstation Wednesday afternoon, "I need you to stop researching yesterday's incident and focus on current caseload. We've received instructions to refer any inquiries about the Mitchell application to federal coordination channels." Tom looked up from his computer screen with the frustrated expression of someone whose questions had been met with bureaucratic walls rather than answers. "Mrs. Peterson, I'm just trying to understand the proper procedures for cases involving federal assets and classification issues. My training didn't cover situations where verification exceeds our clearance levels." Carol's response carried the weight of someone who'd received similar instructions from her own superiors. "Tom, sometimes the proper procedure is to recognize when cases exceed our jurisdiction and refer them to agencies with appropriate authority. That's what we're doing with the Mitchell file." The conversation was overheard by Janet Walsh, who'd been processing routine applications while trying to understand why a seemingly straightforward survivor benefit case had generated so much complexity. 15 years of working with military families had given her instincts about authenticity that rarely proved wrong, and something about Sarah Mitchell's demeanor had suggested genuine military connection rather than fraud. "Carol," Janet said, joining the conversation, "in 15 years of working here, I've never seen a case just disappear into federal channels like this. Usually, when there are jurisdiction issues, we get explanation and coordination procedures. This feels different." Carol understood Janet's concern, but her own instructions had been clear about avoiding speculation or discussion of cases that involved federal coordination. "Janet, sometimes our job is to recognize when situations require different expertise than we can provide. The Mitchell case is being handled through appropriate channels. The administrative closure satisfied bureaucratic requirements, while leaving everyone involved with questions that couldn't be answered through normal procedures." Tom returned to his routine caseload, but found himself approaching each new application with greater awareness of the complexities that could lurk beneath apparently straightforward requests. Mike Chen discovered that his vocal skepticism about military wives and benefit fraud had attracted attention from other veterans who shared his concerns about system integrity. His comments at the Veterans Center had been repeated through informal networks of people who felt that legitimate veterans were being overshadowed by individuals whose service couldn't be verified through normal channels. Wednesday evening found Mike at the American Legion post on Elm Street, sharing his account of the previous day's events with an audience of veterans who understood his frustration with perceived system abuse. The Legion Hall occupied a converted warehouse that had housed 3 different businesses before becoming the social center for Cedar Falls veterans, its walls decorated with photographs and memorabilia from conflicts spanning 7 decades. "I'm telling you," Mike said to the assembled group, "this woman shows up with no documentation, claims her husband died in some kind of classified operation, and when we ask for verification, suddenly it's all federal jurisdiction and national security. Real veterans don't hide behind classification when asked to prove their service." His audience nodded with the solidarity of people who'd completed extensive paperwork to access their own benefits, many of whom had struggled with bureaucratic delays and verification requirements that seemed designed to discourage legitimate claims. The suggestion that someone could bypass these procedures through claims of classification struck them as fundamentally unfair. Robert Haynes sat in the back of the room, listening to Mike's account with the patient attention of someone whose age had taught him to consider multiple perspectives before forming conclusions. 72 years of life had shown him that situations were often more complex than they initially appeared, and that strong opinions could cloud judgment in ways that led to unfortunate consequences. "Mike," Robert said, his voice carrying the authority that came with age and experience, "I've been thinking about what happened yesterday, and I'm not sure we understood everything that was going on." Mike turned toward Robert with the respectful attention that the older veteran's service record commanded. "What do you mean, sir?" Robert chose his words carefully, aware that his observations would influence how the group interpreted events that none of them fully understood. "That federal marshal recognized something about the woman that the rest of us missed. Someone with her training and clearance level doesn't get involved in routine fraud investigations." The observation created a moment of uncomfortable silence in the Legion Hall. Robert's suggestion that they might have misjudged the situation challenged assumptions that had provided comfortable explanations for events that didn't fit normal patterns. "But, sir," Mike replied, "if she was legitimate, why couldn't she provide basic documentation about her husband's service? Real military families have paperwork for everything." Robert's response came with the careful precision of someone who'd learned that military operations often require different standards than civilian assumptions suggested. "Son, I served in Korea when we were doing things that didn't appear in any official records until decades later. Sometimes the most important missions are the ones that can't be documented through normal channels." Meanwhile, Sarah Mitchell was discovering that her attempt to access survivor benefits had created complications that extended beyond bureaucratic rejection. Her official status as deceased provided operational cover, but also prevented her from accessing civilian support systems designed for military families transitioning to non-military life. She spent Wednesday evening in the small apartment that served as her civilian cover, reviewing financial records that painted a stark picture of someone trying to maintain normal life while officially not existing. The rent was paid through a complex arrangement involving federal contractors and shell companies. Utilities were maintained through automated systems that didn't require personal verification. Even her driver's license existed in a bureaucratic gray area that allowed her to function in civilian society while remaining officially deceased in military records. The irony wasn't lost on her that she could execute complex operations in hostile territory, but struggled to navigate the civilian bureaucracy designed to support people like herself. Her training had prepared her for almost every conceivable threat, except the challenge of proving her eligibility for benefits while maintaining the operational security that protected ongoing missions. Her secure communication device activated with the subtle vibration that indicated priority contact from operational command. The message was brief and encrypted, requiring decryption protocols that she'd memorized rather than documented. When decoded, it contained instructions that confirmed her suspicions about the previous day's events. Operational security may be compromised due to civilian bureaucratic exposure. Prepare for possible extraction and cover identity transition. Maintain current protocols pending further instruction. The message represented everything that was both necessary and tragic about her situation. The operational requirements that protected her missions also isolated her from normal institutional support, creating a cycle where attempts to access civilian benefits threatened the very security that justified her sacrifice. She composed her response using encryption methods that required physical destruction of the communication device after transmission. Her reply was economical and precise, reflecting years of training in operational communication protocols. Cover identity intact. Civilian exposure contained through federal intervention. Request permission to maintain current position pending resolution of benefit access issues. The response would travel through communication channels that spanned multiple agencies and classification levels before reaching decision-makers who possessed authority to balance operational security against personnel welfare. Sarah understood that her request would be evaluated according to criteria that prioritized mission requirements over individual needs, but she also understood that some battles were worth fighting even when victory remained uncertain. Thursday morning brought unexpected developments that transformed the administrative closure of Sarah's case into active federal coordination. Elena Rodriguez received clearance to participate in briefings that revealed the scope of operations that had been concealed behind classification levels she'd never known existed. The Defense Intelligence Agency facility occupied an unremarkable office building in Columbus, its exterior giving no indication of the sensitive work conducted within its secured perimeter. Elena's escort, a woman who identified herself only as Agent Chen, guided her through security procedures that exceeded anything she'd experienced in 15 years of federal law enforcement. Marshal Rodriguez, Agent Chen said, settling into a conference room that was designed to prevent electronic surveillance, "Your report about the ring identification has created some interesting challenges for ongoing operations." Elena understood that her recognition of Sarah's status had connected her to information that existed well beyond her normal clearance level. "Agent Chen, I want to be clear that I didn't seek this information. I was conducting routine liaison work when I encountered someone whose identification suggested federal connection." Agent Chen nodded with the understanding of someone who'd navigated similar intersections between routine operations and classified activities. "Marshal, sometimes operational security requires that we bring people into knowledge they didn't request. Your background and clearance level make you suitable for limited briefing on matters that affect federal law enforcement coordination." The briefing that followed lasted 3 hours and covered operational details that Elena would spend years trying to fully understand. The Widowmaker unit, she learned, represented a level of operational sophistication that exceeded normal special operations parameters. Personnel assigned to the unit were officially listed as killed in action to provide cover for missions that required absolute deniability. "The ring you identified," Agent Chen explained, "contains microscopic identification that's visible only under specific light conditions. It serves as both operational identification and memorial acknowledgement for service that can never be publicly recognized." Elena's recognition of the ring's significance had been based on peripheral exposure to interagency briefings, but the full scope of what she'd witnessed at the Veterans Center was only becoming clear through this classified briefing. "Agent Chen, are you telling me that Sarah Mitchell is officially dead according to military records?" The question struck at the heart of operational security requirements that created impossible situations for personnel who served in ways that couldn't be acknowledged. "Marshal Rodriguez, the woman you encountered exists in a classification level that requires different handling than normal law enforcement procedures provide." Elena understood that her involvement in the case had been transformed from routine investigation to ongoing operational security concern. "What are my responsibilities regarding local law enforcement inquiries?" Agent Chen's response came with the measured precision of someone explaining procedures that balanced competing requirements. "You'll receive coordination authority that allows you to manage local inquiries without compromising operational security. Detective Santos and the Veterans Center staff will be briefed on procedures that protect ongoing missions while addressing their legitimate concerns." The solution represented the kind of complex coordination that federal agencies employed when operational requirements intersected with civilian institutions that lacked appropriate clearance levels. Elena would serve as liaison between local authorities and federal operations, providing enough information to satisfy bureaucratic requirements without compromising missions that required absolute security. Friday afternoon brought resolution to the administrative questions that had consumed the Veterans Center staff since Sarah's departure. Carol Peterson received a call from federal coordination offices that provided guidance for handling applications that involved personnel with classification issues exceeding county jurisdiction. Mrs. Peterson, the federal coordinator, explained, "You'll be receiving updated procedures for cases involving federal assets whose service records exist in classification levels above normal verification systems. These procedures will allow you to process legitimate claims without compromising operational security." The conversation lasted 20 minutes and covered administrative protocols that Carol had never encountered in 20 years of veteran services work. When it concluded, she understood that Sarah Mitchell's case represented a category of service that required different verification procedures than standard military records provided. She called Tom Bradley and Janet Walsh into her office to brief them on procedures that would allow them to handle similar cases without experiencing the confusion and uncertainty that had characterized their interaction with Sarah. Tom, Carol said, "You're going to receive training on procedures for processing applications from personnel whose service exists in classified systems. This training will give you verification methods that don't require access to standard military databases." Tom's relief was visible as he realized that his inability to verify Sarah's claims had been due to clearance limitations rather than training deficiencies. "Mrs. Peterson, does this mean the Mitchell application was legitimate?" Carol's response came with the careful precision of someone who'd been briefed on classification requirements that prevented detailed discussion. "Tom, it means that some service members serve in ways that require different verification procedures than normal military records provide. Our job is to ensure that legitimate claims are processed regardless of the classification levels involved." The explanation satisfied Tom's need for procedural clarity while maintaining the operational security that protected ongoing missions. He would receive training that allowed him to recognize legitimate claims from personnel whose service couldn't be verified through normal channels. But he would never receive details about specific operations or unit designations. Janet Walsh accepted the briefing with the understanding of someone who'd spent 15 years learning to recognize authentic military families, regardless of the specific circumstances that brought them to veteran services. "Carol, I always thought there was something genuine about her demeanor. She carried herself like someone with real military experience." The observation reflected Janet's institutional knowledge about authentic military connection, knowledge that had been correct even when the specific details of Sarah's service couldn't be verified through normal procedures. Her instincts about military families had proven accurate, even when the bureaucratic systems designed to verify those instincts had failed. Detective Rick Santos received his briefing through law enforcement channels that emphasized coordination procedures rather than operational details. His captain, Joseph Martinez, explained the federal coordination requirements that would govern any future encounters with personnel whose service existed in classification levels above normal police authority. "Santos," Captain Martinez said, "you're going to receive training on recognition procedures for federal assets whose status requires different handling than normal law enforcement provides. This training will help you identify situations that require federal coordination rather than local investigation." Rick's understanding of the previous week's events shifted as he realized that his decision to defer to federal authority had been correct for reasons that exceeded his initial knowledge. "Captain, was the woman legitimate?" Martinez's response came with the measured authority of someone who'd been briefed on classification requirements that prevented detailed discussion. "Santos, she was someone whose service to this country requires protection that extends beyond normal recognition. Your job is to ensure that future encounters with similar personnel are handled through appropriate coordination channels." The explanation provided Rick with procedural clarity while maintaining the operational security that protected ongoing missions. He would receive training that allowed him to recognize situations requiring federal coordination, but he would never receive details about specific operations or personnel. Mike Chen never received official briefing about the true nature of Sarah's service, but his conversation with Robert Haynes at the American Legion had planted seeds of doubt about his initial conclusions. The older veteran's suggestion that situations were often more complex than they appeared had influenced Mike's thinking in ways that made him less certain about his judgments. Friday evening found Mike sitting in the same chair at the Legion Hall, where he'd shared his account of the Veterans Center incident, but his conversation with the assembled veterans carried a different tone than his earlier commentary. "I've been thinking about what happened this week," Mike said to the group, "and I'm wondering if maybe we didn't understand everything that was going on." Robert Haynes nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose patience had been vindicated by subsequent events. "Mike, one thing I learned in Korea is that the most important operations are often the ones we never hear about. The people who do that kind of work don't get parades or recognition ceremonies. They just do the job and carry the weight." The observation resonated with veterans who understood that service took many forms, not all of which received public acknowledgement. Mike's certainty about benefit fraud had been replaced by questions about forms of service that existed beyond his experience and knowledge. Sarah Mitchell received notification Friday evening that her benefit application had been processed through federal coordination channels that provided access to survivor benefits without compromising her operational status. The notification came through the same secure communication system that had warned her about potential extraction, but the tone carried relief rather than concern. "Application approved through classified coordination procedures. Benefits will be processed through federal contractor systems that maintain operational security. Cover identity remains intact." The resolution represented months of complex coordination between agencies that rarely communicated directly, balancing personnel welfare against operational requirements that demanded absolute secrecy. Sarah's attempt to access civilian benefits had succeeded, but through procedures that reinforced rather than compromised the classification that protected her missions. She sat in her small apartment Friday evening, examining the silver ring that had started the entire bureaucratic crisis. Under normal lighting, it remained completely unremarkable, the kind of simple wedding band that millions of people wore without attracting attention. But under specific conditions, it revealed identification that connected her to service that existed beyond public recognition. The irony wasn't lost on her that her attempt to prove her eligibility for survivor benefits had resulted in procedures that better protected her operational security than any training manual could have provided. The bureaucratic crisis had become an opportunity to improve coordination between agencies that shared responsibility for personnel whose service couldn't be acknowledged through normal channels. The Veterans Center returned to its normal rhythm of processing applications and providing services to military families navigating the complex web of federal benefits. Tom Bradley approached each new case with greater awareness of the complexities that could exist beneath apparently straightforward requests. Carol Peterson updated her procedures manual to include protocols for handling applications from personnel whose service existed in classification levels above normal verification systems. Janet Walsh continued to rely on her 15 years of experience in recognizing authentic military families, but with greater confidence that her instincts about genuine service were valid even when bureaucratic systems couldn't verify the specific details. The lesson had been absorbed into the institutional memory of everyone involved, but in ways that protected operational security while improving procedures for handling similar cases. Some service existed beyond public recognition, but that didn't make it less valid or less deserving of support. Some heroes served in ways that couldn't be acknowledged, but their sacrifice was no less real for being classified. And somewhere in the small apartment that served as her civilian cover, a woman who officially didn't exist sat quietly with the satisfaction of someone who'd completed her mission despite bureaucratic obstacles, maintained operational security under pressure, and reminded a room full of strangers that service took many forms, not all of which could be measured by normal standards. The silver ring remained in her jewelry box, unremarkable to casual observation, but carrying the weight of operations that would never be declassified and service that would never be fully acknowledged. For 1 week in one bureaucratic office, its meaning had been recognized by someone who understood that heroes don't always fit the patterns that civilian institutions expect them to follow. The phone call that changed everything came at 6:15 on a gray Monday morning, 3 weeks after Sarah Mitchell had walked out of the Fairfield County Veterans Services Center. Elena Rodriguez answered her secure line to find Deputy Director Amanda Walsh from the Defense Intelligence Agency on the other end, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent the weekend reviewing classified files that painted a very different picture of recent events. "Marshal Rodriguez, I need you to return to the Veterans Center this morning. We've received authorization to conduct a formal clarification briefing for local personnel who were involved in the Mitchell incident." Elena had been expecting this call since her briefing in Columbus, but the timing suggested that something significant had changed in the federal coordination that had been protecting Sarah's operational status. Director Walsh, has there been a development in the case? The pause that followed stretched long enough to suggest that Amanda Walsh was choosing her words with consideration for their broader implications. Marshal, we've received clearance to reveal certain operational details that will help local personnel understand why their normal verification procedures failed. This briefing will provide context that should prevent similar incidents in the future. Elena understood that her role was shifting from protective liaison to active participant in an unprecedented disclosure of classified information, to civilian personnel who'd inadvertently intersected with operations that existed well beyond their clearance levels. Director Walsh, what level of detail are we authorized to reveal? The question struck at the heart of operational security requirements that had to be balanced against the need to educate local personnel who might encounter similar situations in the future. Marshal, you'll receive specific briefing parameters when you arrive at the center. The goal is to provide enough information to prevent future classification conflicts without compromising ongoing operations. Elena arrived at the Veterans Center at 8:30 to find that the normal Monday morning routine had been suspended to accommodate a briefing that none of the staff fully understood. Carol Peterson had received instructions to assemble all personnel who'd been involved in the Mitchell case, along with key administrative staff who might encounter similar situations in the future. The main waiting area had been cleared of clients and reconfigured to accommodate a presentation that would challenge fundamental assumptions about military service and official recognition. Tom Bradley sat in the front row with the nervous attention of someone who suspected his training was about to be revealed as inadequate for situations he might encounter regularly. Janet Walsh occupied a chair near the center of the room, her 15 years of experience with military families, providing her with confidence that whatever they were about to learn would help her better serve the veterans and families who depended on county services. Detective Rick Santos and Captain Joseph Martinez represented local law enforcement, their presence indicating that the briefing would address coordination procedures that affected both administrative and investigative responsibilities. Even Mike Chen had been invited, his status as a vocal skeptic of the Mitchell case making him a valuable test case for whether the forthcoming information could change strongly held opinions about benefit eligibility and service verification. Elena began the briefing by establishing the security parameters that would govern their discussion. Everyone in this room has been granted temporary clearance for information that normally exists well above civilian access levels. What you learn here today is classified and cannot be discussed outside this group without federal authorization. The warning carried weight that exceeded normal administrative confidentiality requirements. Elena's tone suggested that the information they were about to receive would fundamentally change their understanding of military service and the institutional systems designed to support it. 3 weeks ago, you encountered a woman whose benefit application couldn't be verified through normal military databases. Your inability to confirm her husband's service record wasn't due to fraud or administrative error. It was due to the operational requirements of a unit that exists beyond standard military documentation. Tom Bradley raised his hand with the tentative gesture of someone seeking clarification about something that challenged his basic understanding of military record-keeping. Marshal Rodriguez, are you saying that some military units don't appear in normal databases? Elena's response came with the measured precision of someone explaining concepts that existed outside civilian experience. Tom, I'm saying that some military operations require personnel to be officially listed as deceased to provide operational cover for missions that demand absolute deniability. The revelation struck the assembled group like a physical blow. The concept that military personnel could be officially dead while remaining operationally active challenged fundamental assumptions about military service and administrative accountability. Carol Peterson's 20 years of experience with veteran benefits had never prepared her for the possibility that legitimate service members might be excluded from the verification systems she'd relied on throughout her career. Marshal, are you telling us that Sarah Mitchell's husband is actually alive? Elena paused, recognizing that her next words would fundamentally alter their understanding of everything that had occurred during the Mitchell case. Mrs. Peterson, I'm telling you that Sarah Mitchell never had a husband. The silence that followed was so complete that the hum of fluorescent lights seemed deafening by comparison. Elena could see the mental recalibration occurring as each person in the room processed the implications of what she'd just revealed. Mike Chen was the first to find his voice, though it carried none of the confident authority that had characterized his earlier commentary about military wives and benefit fraud. Marshal, if she didn't have a husband, then why was she applying for survivor benefits? Elena's response required her to reveal operational details that would forever change how everyone in the room understood military service and the sacrifices it sometimes demanded. Mike, Sarah Mitchell wasn't applying for benefits as a military wife. She was applying for benefits as a deceased service member whose official status prevented her from accessing the support systems designed for people exactly like herself. Tom Bradley's face went pale as he processed the full implications of what Elena was revealing. "You're saying that she was the one who died?" But she was sitting right there, filling out paperwork. Elena nodded with the gravity of someone explaining truths that existed beyond normal civilian comprehension. "Tom, Sarah Mitchell is officially listed as killed in action during a classified operation 18 months ago. Her death certificate exists in military records. Her memorial service was conducted with full honors. Her parents received a folded flag and official condolences from the highest levels of military command." The revelation transformed everyone's understanding of the afternoon 3 weeks earlier, when they'd questioned Sarah's credibility and challenged her right to receive benefits. Carol Peterson felt the weight of 20 years of experience crumbling as she realized that her skepticism had been directed towards someone whose service exceeded anything she'd encountered in 2 decades of working with military families. "But if she's officially dead," Carol said, her voice barely above a whisper, "how is she applying for benefits?" Elena's explanation required her to reveal the operational complexities that created impossible situations for personnel who served in ways that couldn't be acknowledged through normal channels. "Mrs. Peterson, Sarah Mitchell serves in a unit that requires personnel to maintain civilian identities while remaining operationally active. Her official death provides cover for missions that would be compromised if her survival became known to hostile intelligence services." Janet Walsh raised her hand with the careful gesture of someone whose institutional knowledge was being challenged in ways that required fundamental recalibration. "Marshal, in 15 years of working with military families, I've never encountered someone whose service required them to be officially dead. How common is this?" Elena's response came with the measured precision of someone revealing information that existed at the absolute limits of what could be disclosed without compromising ongoing operations. "Janet, the unit Sarah serves in has fewer than 30 active personnel worldwide. They handle operations that can't be acknowledged without compromising national security interests that extend beyond normal military objectives." Detective Rick Santos leaned forward with the focused attention of someone whose law enforcement experience was being challenged by operational realities that exceeded normal civilian understanding. "Marshal, what kind of operations require personnel to be officially dead?" Elena paused, recognizing that her answer would reveal operational details that could affect ongoing missions if discussed outside the security parameters of this briefing. Detective Santos. Sarah Mitchell's unit specializes in deep reconnaissance and target elimination in territory controlled by hostile forces. Her missions involve spending months in areas where capture would result in torture, execution, and compromise of intelligence assets that protect ongoing operations. The description painted a picture of service that exceeded anything the assembled group had previously imagined. Mike Chen, who'd been so vocal about his skepticism regarding Sarah's claims, sat in stunned silence as he processed the reality that his assumptions about military wives and benefit fraud had been completely wrong. "Marshal," Mike said, his voice carrying none of its earlier confidence, "are you telling us that this woman has been conducting combat operations while officially dead?" Elena's response required her to reveal operational details that would forever change Mike's understanding of military service and the people who served in ways that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. "Mike, in the past 18 months, Sarah Mitchell has conducted 7 deep reconnaissance missions in territories so hostile that satellite coverage is classified as unreliable. She's provided intelligence that prevented 3 major terrorist attacks and eliminated targets that posed direct threats to American personnel worldwide." The revelation struck Mike with the force of a physical blow. His vocal skepticism about Sarah's legitimacy had been based on assumptions about military service that bore no relationship to the operational realities that shaped the world in ways he'd never imagined. Tom Bradley raised his hand again, his voice carrying the confused tone of someone whose training was being revealed as inadequate for situations he might encounter regularly. "Marshal, if personnel like Sarah Mitchell exist, why don't we have procedures for processing their benefit applications?" Elena's explanation revealed the bureaucratic complexities that created impossible situations for personnel whose service couldn't be acknowledged through normal administrative channels. Tom, until 3 weeks ago, no one in a unit like Sarah's had ever attempted to access civilian benefits while maintaining operational status. The operational security requirements that protect their missions also isolate them from the support systems designed for military families. Carol Peterson felt the weight of bureaucratic responsibility as she realized that her procedures manual contained no guidance for situations involving personnel whose service existed beyond normal verification systems. Marshal, how are we supposed to process benefit applications from people who are officially dead? Elena's response revealed the federal coordination procedures that had been developed in response to the Mitchell case, procedures that would allow civilian agencies to support personnel whose service couldn't be acknowledged through normal channels. Mrs. Peterson, you'll receive updated protocols for recognizing and processing applications from personnel whose service exists in classification levels above normal verification systems. The explanation provided Carol with procedural guidance while maintaining the operational security that protected ongoing missions. She would receive training that allowed her to recognize legitimate claims from personnel like Sarah, but she would never receive details about specific operations or mission parameters. Captain Martinez leaned forward with the focused attention of someone whose law enforcement responsibilities were being expanded in ways that required fundamental recalibration of his understanding of federal coordination. Marshal Rodriguez, what are our responsibilities if we encounter personnel like Sarah Mitchell in the future? Elena's response revealed the law enforcement coordination procedures that had been established to prevent future conflicts between operational security and civilian bureaucracy. Captain Martinez, you'll receive training on recognition procedures for federal assets whose status requires coordination rather than investigation. This training will help you identify situations that require federal liaison rather than local law enforcement action. The briefing continued for another hour, covering operational details that challenged fundamental assumptions about military service and the institutional systems designed to support it. Elena revealed that Sarah's unit, officially designated as Widowmaker Company, had been conducting operations that prevented conflicts rather than responding to them. The unit's designation reflects the nature of their missions, Elena explained. They eliminate threats before those threats can develop into conflicts that would require conventional military response. Their work prevents wars rather than fighting them. Mike Chen raised his hand with the humble gesture of someone whose certainty had been completely shattered by information that exceeded his previous understanding. Marshal, how many operations has Sarah Mitchell conducted that we'll never hear about? Elena's response revealed the scope of service that existed beyond public recognition, service that shaped the world in ways that most people would never comprehend. Mike, in 18 months of operational status, Sarah has completed missions that prevented conflicts which would have required thousands of conventional troops and resulted in casualties that would have made headlines worldwide. The revelation painted a picture of service that exceeded normal concepts of military duty and sacrifice. Sarah hadn't just served her country. She'd prevented conflicts that would have required massive military interventions and resulted in casualties that would have affected thousands of families. Janet Walsh found her voice again, though it carried the humbled tone of someone whose institutional knowledge had been revealed as incomplete. Marshal, when Sarah was sitting in our waiting room, was she coming here directly from a mission? Elena's response revealed operational details that illustrated the jarring transition between life-and-death missions and mundane civilian bureaucracy. Janet, Sarah completed a target elimination mission in Eastern Europe 72 hours before she walked into your office. She traveled from a hostile territory where her capture would have resulted in international incident to a county office, where she was questioned about her husband's service record. The contrast between operational reality and civilian assumptions struck everyone in the room with stunning clarity. While they'd been questioning Sarah's credibility and challenging her right to receive benefits, she'd been transitioning from missions that protected national security to bureaucratic procedures that she couldn't complete without compromising the operational security that made her missions possible. Tom Bradley's voice carried genuine remorse as he processed the full implications of how they'd treated someone whose service exceeded anything he'd previously imagined. Marshal, we treated her like she was trying to defraud the system. Elena's response came with the understanding of someone who recognized that civilian assumptions about military service were based on limited knowledge of operational realities. Tom, you treated her exactly the way your training taught you to treat benefit applications that couldn't be verified through normal procedures. Your skepticism was appropriate based on the information available to you. The explanation provided Tom with professional absolution while illustrating the broader challenge of supporting personnel whose service couldn't be acknowledged through normal administrative channels. The conflict hadn't been caused by professional inadequacy, but by operational requirements that exceeded civilian institutional knowledge. Carol Peterson struggled with the bureaucratic implications of what she'd learned, trying to understand how her procedures could be improved to serve personnel whose service existed beyond normal verification systems. Marshal, how do we ensure that legitimate claims from personnel like Sarah are processed without compromising operational security? Elena's response revealed the federal coordination procedures that had been established to balance personnel welfare against operational requirements. Mrs. Peterson, you'll receive secure communication protocols that allow you to verify service without accessing classified databases. These protocols will provide confirmation of eligibility without revealing operational details that could compromise ongoing missions. The solution represented complex coordination between agencies that rarely communicated directly, but Elena's explanation suggested that the Mitchell case had catalyzed improvements in interagency cooperation that would benefit future personnel who found themselves in similar situations. Detective Rick Santos raised his hand with the careful gesture of someone whose law enforcement experience was being expanded to include operational realities that exceeded normal civilian authority. Marshal, if we encounter someone like Sarah Mitchell in the future, how do we distinguish between legitimate federal assets and people attempting to use classification claims to avoid investigation? Elena's response revealed authentication procedures that would allow local law enforcement to coordinate with federal agencies without compromising operational security. Detective Santos, you'll receive training on recognition procedures and communication protocols that allow you to verify federal asset status through secure channels. This training will help you identify situations that require coordination rather than investigation. The explanation provided Rick with procedural guidance that would prevent future conflicts between local law enforcement and federal operations, while maintaining his ability to investigate legitimate fraud cases. Mike Chen sat in stunned silence throughout most of the briefing, processing the complete reversal of everything he'd believed about the Mitchell case. When Elena called for final questions, he raised his hand with the humbled gesture of someone whose certainty had been completely shattered. "Marshal," Mike said, his voice carrying genuine remorse, "I said things about Sarah Mitchell that were completely wrong. I questioned her right to receive benefits when she'd been risking her life to protect people like me. How do I make that right?" Elena's response came with the understanding of someone who recognized that civilian assumptions about military service were based on limited knowledge of operational realities that most people never encountered. "Mike, you can make it right by understanding that service takes many forms, not all of which can be recognized through public channels. Sarah Mitchell serves in ways that prevent conflicts rather than fighting them, but her sacrifice is no less real for being classified." The explanation provided Mike with perspective that would influence how he approached future encounters with military personnel whose service might not fit normal patterns of recognition and verification. As the briefing concluded, Elena delivered a final piece of information that illustrated the ongoing nature of operational requirements that shaped personnel like Sarah Mitchell. Before we conclude, I want you to understand that Sarah Mitchell will return to operational status within the next 30 days. The benefits she sought to access will be provided through federal coordination, but she'll continue to serve in ways that require her to remain officially deceased. The revelation illustrated the ongoing nature of service that existed beyond normal civilian comprehension. Sarah's attempt to access survivor benefits had been resolved through federal coordination, but her operational requirements would continue to isolate her from normal civilian support systems. Carol Peterson asked the question that everyone was thinking but no one had voiced. "Marshal, will we ever see Sarah Mitchell again?" Elena's response came with the measured precision of someone explaining operational realities that exceeded normal civilian experience. "Mrs. Peterson, if you encounter Sarah Mitchell in the future, it will be because she's transitioning between missions that require her to maintain civilian identity. Your job will be to provide the services she needs without questioning the operational requirements that bring her to your office." The explanation provided procedural guidance while illustrating the ongoing nature of service that required personnel to exist in the space between official recognition and operational necessity. As the briefing participants filed out of the Veterans Center, Each carried with them a fundamentally altered understanding of military service and the people who served in ways that couldn't be acknowledged through normal channels. Tom Bradley returned to his processing window with greater awareness of the complexities that could exist beneath apparently straightforward benefit applications. Carol Peterson updated her procedures manual to include protocols for handling applications from personnel whose service existed in classification levels above normal verification systems. But she did so with the understanding that some service would always exceed the capacity of civilian institutions to fully comprehend or adequately support. Janet Walsh continued to rely on her 15 years of experience in recognizing authentic military families, but with profound respect for forms of service that existed beyond her institutional knowledge and understanding. Detective Rick Santos reported back to his captain with new procedures for coordinating with federal agencies when local investigations intersected with operations that exceeded civilian law enforcement authority. Mike Chen returned to the American Legion that evening with a story that would fundamentally change how the assembled veterans understood service and sacrifice. His account of the briefing would influence conversations for months, creating greater awareness of the hidden infrastructure of service that protected civilian life in ways that most people would never comprehend. The lesson, absorbed into the institutional memory of everyone involved, wasn't just about Sarah Mitchell or the Widowmaker unit. It was about the invisible infrastructure of service that operated beyond public recognition, about people who served in ways that required them to sacrifice not just their lives but their very existence for missions that shaped the world in ways that civilian institutions were never designed to understand. And somewhere in the classified coordination channels that connected federal agencies across multiple time zones, a message was transmitted confirming that civilian support systems had been successfully modified to accommodate personnel whose service existed beyond normal recognition parameters, ensuring that future heroes who served in the shadows would receive the support they'd earned without compromising the operational security that made their missions possible. 6 months after the federal briefing that had transformed everyone's understanding of Sarah Mitchell and the Widowmaker unit, the Fairfield County Veterans Services Center had settled into a new rhythm that reflected hard-earned wisdom about the complexities of military service. The changes weren't dramatic or immediately visible to casual observers, but they represented fundamental shifts in how staff approached their responsibilities and interacted with the military families who depended on their services. Tom Bradley had become something of an expert on classification protocols and federal coordination procedures, his experience with the Mitchell case having earned him recognition within the county system as someone who understood the intersection between routine administration and operational security. His desk now displayed a small placard identifying him as the Federal Asset Liaison, a title that carried responsibilities he'd never imagined when he'd first taken the job 6 months earlier. The morning of November 15th brought the kind of crisp autumn weather that made Ohio beautiful, with golden leaves swirling across the Veterans Center parking lot as clients arrived for their appointments. Tom was reviewing a complex disability claim when Janet Walsh approached his window with the measured urgency that indicated something unusual but not necessarily problematic. "Tom," Janet said quietly, "there's someone here who says she needs to speak with you specifically about federal coordination procedures." Tom looked up from his paperwork to see a woman standing near the reception desk, her appearance striking him as familiar, though he couldn't immediately place her. Mid-30s, wearing civilian clothes that suggested careful attention to blending into suburban environments, carrying herself with the particular quality of controlled awareness that he'd learned to recognize as military bearing. She approached his window with economical movements, placing a manila envelope in the pass-through slot, along with identification that Tom examined with the careful attention that had become second nature since his training in federal asset recognition protocols. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying the measured calm that Tom had learned to associate with personnel whose service existed beyond normal verification parameters. "I understand you handle federal coordination cases now." Tom studied her driver's license and the accompanying documentation that indicated federal contractor status, his trained eye cataloging details that would have escaped his notice 6 months earlier. The identification was legitimate, but carried subtle markers that suggested classification issues requiring special handling. "Yes, ma'am," Tom replied, his voice carrying the professional confidence that came from specialized training. "I can assist you with applications that involve federal coordination. What kind of services are you seeking?" The woman's response came with the careful timing that Tom had learned to recognize as operational discipline rather than uncertainty, I need to update my benefit status following a change in operational assignment. The terminology triggered recognition protocols that Tom had memorized during his federal asset training. Operational assignment changes often indicated transitions between classified missions that required administrative coordination to maintain civilian cover identities. "Certainly," Tom said, activating the secure communication terminal that had been installed following the Mitchell case. "Let me access the Federal Coordination Database and verify your current status." The verification process that followed represented months of interagency coordination designed to balance operational security against personnel welfare. Tom's terminal connected to classified databases that provided confirmation of federal asset status without revealing operational details that could compromise ongoing missions. The verification confirmed what Tom had suspected based on the woman's demeanor and documentation. She was listed in federal systems as active personnel requiring special handling, her service record existing in classification levels that exceeded normal county access, but were accessible through the coordination protocols that had been established following the Mitchell case. "I'm showing that your current status requires federal coordination for benefit processing," Tom said, his voice carrying the professional competence that had developed through months of handling similar cases. "I can initiate the secure coordination process that will allow us to update your benefits without compromising your operational requirements." The woman nodded with the understanding of someone whose operational experience had taught her to appreciate competent administration. "Thank you. I wasn't sure if local offices had developed procedures for handling personnel in my situation." Tom's response reflected the institutional knowledge that had grown from the Mitchell case and subsequent training. "Ma'am, we've learned that service takes many forms, and our responsibility is to ensure that all legitimate personnel receive the support they've earned, regardless of the classification levels involved." The exchange represented everything that had changed about the Veteran Center's approach to complex cases. Tom's ability to recognize federal asset status and initiate appropriate coordination procedures meant that personnel like Sarah Mitchell would never again face the bureaucratic obstacles and skepticism that had characterized their earlier encounter. Carol Peterson observed the interaction from her supervisory position, her 20 years of experience now supplemented by hard-earned wisdom about operational realities that exceeded normal administrative knowledge. The Mitchell case had taught her that institutional competence required continuous learning and adaptation to serve populations whose needs exceeded traditional assumptions about military families. She approached Tom's window as he completed the federal coordination process, her expression carrying the professional satisfaction that came from watching her staff apply specialized training to serve personnel whose service couldn't be acknowledged through normal channels. "Tom," Carol said, "how did the coordination process work?" Tom's response reflected both technical competence and broader understanding of the operational realities that shaped personnel like the woman he'd just assisted. "Mrs. Peterson, the new protocols worked exactly as designed. I was able to verify her status and initiate benefit updates without accessing classified information or compromising operational security." Carol nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose administrative responsibilities had been expanded to include support for personnel whose service existed beyond normal institutional knowledge. The federal coordination procedures that had been developed following the Mitchell case represented successful interagency cooperation that balanced competing requirements while serving people who'd sacrificed everything for missions that most civilians would never comprehend. Meanwhile, Detective Rick Santos was discovering that his expanded training in federal asset recognition had applications beyond routine patrol duties. His morning briefing included notification of federal personnel conducting operations in the Cedar Falls area, information that would help him avoid inadvertent interference with classified missions while maintaining normal law enforcement responsibilities. The notification didn't include operational details or personnel identities, but it provided enough context to help Rick recognize situations that required federal coordination rather than local investigation. His experience with the Mitchell case had taught him that some law enforcement challenges required different approaches than normal criminal investigation procedures. Captain Martinez had become something of a regional expert on federal coordination protocols, his department's successful handling of the Mitchell case having earned recognition from state and federal agencies as a model for local law enforcement cooperation with classified operations. "Santos," Captain Martinez said during the morning briefing, "we've got federal assets operating in our jurisdiction this week. Standard protocols apply. If you encounter anyone whose behavior suggests specialized training or whose identification indicates federal contractor status, initiate coordination procedures rather than standard investigation. Rick's response reflected months of experience with situations that required careful balance between local law enforcement responsibilities and federal operational requirements. Understood, Captain. Should I expect any specific types of activity that might require attention? Martinez's reply came with the measured precision of someone who'd learned to provide operational guidance without compromising classified information. Santos, you should expect to encounter personnel whose civilian activities might seem unusual until you understand the operational context. Your job is to ensure that normal law enforcement doesn't interfere with federal operations while maintaining security for civilian populations. The guidance represented successful adaptation of local law enforcement to operational realities that existed beyond normal civilian experience. Rick's training in federal asset recognition had prepared him to distinguish between suspicious civilian behavior and legitimate operational activity, preventing conflicts that could compromise both law enforcement effectiveness and federal mission success. At the American Legion post on Elm Street, Mike Chen had become an unofficial educator about the complexities of military service and the importance of supporting personnel whose sacrifice couldn't be acknowledged through normal channels. His transformation from skeptical critic to informed advocate represented one of the most significant personal changes that had emerged from the Mitchell case. "Brothers," Mike said to the assembled veterans during their weekly meeting, "I want to talk about something that's been on my mind since we learned the truth about what happened at the Veterans Center 6 months ago." The group's attention focused on Mike with the respect that his earlier willingness to admit error had earned among people who understood the difficulty of changing strongly held opinions. His journey from certainty to humility had influenced conversations throughout the local veteran community. "We all thought we understood military service based on our own experience," Mike continued. "But the Mitchell case taught me that there are forms of service that exist beyond anything we've personally encountered. People are serving right now in ways that require them to sacrifice not just their lives, but their very existence for missions that keep the rest of us safe." Robert Haynes nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose patience and wisdom had been vindicated by subsequent events. At 73, he'd seen enough to understand that military service encompassed far more complexity than most civilians imagined, and that the most important operations were often the ones that received no public recognition. "Mike's right," Robert said, his voice carrying the authority that came with age and experience. "In Korea, we did things that didn't appear in any official records until decades later. But what we learned about the Mitchell woman goes beyond anything I encountered in my service. These people are operating at levels of classification and sacrifice that exceed normal military experience." The conversation that followed represented the kind of institutional learning that had emerged from the Mitchell case throughout the Cedar Falls veteran community. Mike's willingness to acknowledge his earlier mistakes had created space for other veterans to examine their own assumptions about service and recognition. "The thing that bothers me most," Mike said, "is that while we were questioning her right to receive benefits, she was transitioning from missions that prevented conflicts which would have affected thousands of families. Our skepticism was directed towards someone whose service exceeded anything we'd personally sacrificed." The observation illustrated the broader challenge of supporting personnel whose service couldn't be acknowledged through normal channels. The veteran community's initial resistance to Sarah's claims had been based on institutional knowledge that proved inadequate for understanding operational realities that existed beyond their experience. Meanwhile, Elena Rodriguez had discovered that her role in the Mitchell case had earned her recognition within federal law enforcement as someone who understood the intersection between routine operations and classified activities. Her ability to recognize federal asset status and coordinate appropriate responses had led to additional responsibilities that required her to serve as liaison between local agencies and federal operations. Her secure communication device activated with the priority signal that indicated coordination requirements related to ongoing operations in her jurisdiction. The message was brief and encrypted, requiring decryption protocols that she'd memorized rather than documented. "Federal assets conducting operational transition in your jurisdiction. Local coordination may be required to prevent inadvertent interference with classified activities." The notification represented the kind of interagency communication that had been developed following the Mitchell case, providing federal marshals with situational awareness that allowed them to coordinate local responses without compromising operational security. Elena understood that her jurisdiction included personnel whose missions required them to maintain civilian identities while conducting operations that shaped international security in ways that most local officials would never comprehend. Her responsibility was to ensure that routine law enforcement and administrative activities didn't interfere with federal operations while maintaining normal civilian services. She made a mental note to contact local agencies that might encounter federal personnel, providing guidance that would prevent conflicts while maintaining the operational security that protected ongoing missions. The Mitchell case had taught her that successful coordination required proactive communication rather than reactive problem-solving. At the Veterans Center, Janet Walsh was reflecting on how her 15 years of experience with military families had been enhanced by hard-earned wisdom about forms of service that existed beyond normal institutional knowledge. Her instincts about authentic military connection had been correct regarding Sarah Mitchell, but the specific nature of Sarah's service had challenged assumptions that she'd held throughout her career. A young woman approached the reception desk carrying paperwork that Janet recognized as federal contractor documentation, her appearance and demeanor triggering recognition protocols that had become second nature since the Mitchell case. "Good afternoon," the woman said, her voice carrying the measured calm that Janet had learned to associate with personnel whose service existed beyond normal verification parameters. "I need to update my dependent status following a change in operational assignment." Janet's response reflected months of experience with federal coordination procedures and growing understanding of operational realities that shaped personnel who served in classified capacities. "Certainly, I can direct you to our federal asset liaison. Tom Bradley specializes in handling benefit applications that involve classification coordination." The efficient referral represented institutional learning that had emerged from the Mitchell case, ensuring that personnel requiring special handling were immediately directed to staff members with appropriate training and clearance, rather than experiencing the bureaucratic obstacles that had characterized Sarah's initial encounter. "Thank you," the woman replied. "I appreciate having local offices that understand the complexities involved in our situation." Janet's response came with the professional satisfaction that resulted from serving people whose sacrifice exceeded normal civilian comprehension. "Ma'am, we've learned that service takes many forms, and our responsibility is to ensure that everyone who's earned benefits receives the support they deserve, regardless of the operational requirements involved." The exchange illustrated how institutional competence had grown from the Mitchell case, creating capacity to serve populations whose needs had previously exceeded local administrative knowledge. Janet's ability to recognize federal asset status and provide appropriate referral meant that similar personnel would receive competent service rather than experiencing skepticism and bureaucratic resistance. As the afternoon progressed, the Veterans Center processed routine applications with the efficiency that came from improved procedures and expanded understanding of military service complexity. The changes weren't dramatic enough to attract attention from casual observers, but they represented fundamental improvements in the institution's ability to serve populations whose service existed beyond normal verification parameters. Tom Bradley completed processing for 3 federal coordination cases, each involving personnel whose civilian activities required administrative support while maintaining operational security for ongoing missions. His specialized training allowed him to provide necessary services without accessing classified information or compromising mission parameters. Carol Peterson reviewed monthly statistics that showed significant improvement in processing times for complex cases, the enhanced procedures and federal coordination protocols having eliminated the delays and verification problems that had previously characterized difficult applications. Detective Rick Santos concluded his shift without encountering situations that required federal coordination, but his expanded training in asset recognition had influenced his approach to routine patrol duties in ways that created better awareness of operational activities that might affect law enforcement responsibilities. The institutional learning that had emerged from the Mitchell case wasn't limited to individual competence improvements. The federal coordination procedures that had been developed represented successful interagency cooperation that balanced competing requirements while serving people whose sacrifice extended beyond normal recognition parameters. At the Defense Intelligence Agency facility in Columbus, Amanda Walsh reviewed coordination reports that indicated successful implementation of civilian support procedures for classified personnel. The Mitchell case had catalyzed improvements in interagency cooperation that were providing better support for operational personnel while maintaining the security requirements that protected ongoing missions. The Cedar Falls model is working, Amanda noted in her monthly assessment to federal coordination oversight. Local agencies have developed competence in federal asset recognition and coordination procedures that allow them to serve classified personnel without compromising operational security. The assessment represented months of complex coordination between agencies that rarely communicated directly, but the success of the civilian support procedures meant that personnel like Sarah Mitchell would never again face the impossible choice between accessing earned benefits and maintaining operational security. Meanwhile, Sarah Mitchell was discovering that the administrative resolution of her benefit access had created unexpected opportunities for normal life experiences that operational requirements had previously made impossible. Her official status remained classified, but the federal coordination procedures now allowed her to access civilian services without compromising the operational security that protected her missions. She stood in the small apartment that served as her civilian cover, examining mail that included benefit statements and administrative correspondence that confirmed her successful integration into support systems designed for military personnel transitioning to civilian life. The irony wasn't lost on her that her official death had required her to fight bureaucratic battles to access benefits designed for people exactly like herself. Her secure communication device activated with the subtle signal that indicated routine coordination rather than operational urgency. The message was brief and contained information that would influence her immediate planning. Operational assignment transition complete. Civilian support systems confirmed functional. Extended leave authorized pending next mission assignment. The notification represented everything that had changed about her situation since the Veterans Center incident. The bureaucratic crisis that had threatened to expose her operational status had resulted in improved coordination that better protected her security, while providing access to the civilian support systems she'd earned through service that most people would never comprehend. She composed her response using standard communication protocols, acknowledging the extended leave authorization while confirming her readiness for future operational assignments. The message would travel through classified channels to decision-makers who understood that personnel welfare and operational effectiveness were interconnected rather than competing priorities. Civilian integration successful. Support systems functional, prepared for future operational requirements. The response represented successful resolution of challenges that had seemed impossible during her initial encounter with civilian bureaucracy. The federal coordination procedures that had been developed ensured that her future transitions between operational and civilian status would be supported rather than hindered by administrative systems. As evening settled over Cedar Falls, the changes that had emerged from the Mitchell case continued their quiet influence on institutional competence and individual understanding. Tom Bradley prepared to leave the Veterans Center with the professional satisfaction that came from serving personnel whose sacrifice exceeded normal civilian comprehension. Carol Peterson locked her office knowing that her department had developed capability to serve populations whose needs had previously exceeded local administrative knowledge. The federal coordination procedures represented successful adaptation to operational realities that shaped the world in ways that most civilian institutions were never designed to understand. Janet Walsh drove home reflecting on how her 15 years of experience with military families had been enhanced by profound respect for forms of service that existed beyond normal institutional knowledge. Her ability to recognize authentic military connection had been correct regarding Sarah, but learning the truth about Sarah's service had challenged assumptions that she'd carried throughout her career. Detective Rick Santos concluded his shift with expanded understanding of federal coordination requirements that allowed local law enforcement to support rather than hinder operations that exceeded normal civilian authority. His training in asset recognition had prepared him to distinguish between suspicious behavior and legitimate operational activity. Mike Chen arrived at the American Legion that evening carrying a story about institutional learning and personal growth that would influence veteran community conversations for months. His transformation from skeptical critic to informed advocate represented the kind of individual change that created broader cultural shifts in understanding and respect. The lesson absorbed into the institutional memory of everyone involved wasn't just about Sarah Mitchell or the Widowmaker unit. It was about the invisible infrastructure of service that operated beyond public recognition, about people who served in ways that required them to sacrifice not just their lives, but their very existence for missions that shaped the world in ways that civilian institutions were never designed to understand. The silver ring that had started the entire crisis remained in Sarah's jewelry box, unremarkable to casual observation, but carrying weight that exceeded its simple appearance. Under specific lighting conditions, it revealed identification that connected her to service that existed beyond public recognition, service that prevented conflicts rather than fighting them. But the ring's significance had been recognized by people who understood that heroes don't always fit the patterns that civilian institutions expect them to follow. Some service existed beyond normal recognition parameters, but that didn't make it less valid or less deserving of support. Some heroes served in ways that couldn't be acknowledged, but their sacrifice was no less real for being classified. And in the small apartment that served as her civilian cover, a woman who officially didn't exist sat quietly with the satisfaction of someone who'd completed her mission despite bureaucratic obstacles, maintained operational security under pressure, and reminded a room full of strangers that service took many forms, not all of which could be measured by normal standards. The institutional competence that had grown from her struggle would serve future personnel who found themselves navigating the space between operational requirements and civilian support systems. The federal coordination procedures that had been developed would ensure that heroes who served in shadows received the support they'd earned without compromising the missions that justified their sacrifice. Some recognition came through demonstration rather than explanation, and some respect was earned through service that could never be fully acknowledged. But the changes that had emerged from one afternoon in one bureaucratic office would influence how institutions and individuals approached similar encounters for years to come. The world continued its normal patterns, unchanged by the recognition that had occurred in spaces between official procedures and operational reality. But for those who understood the true cost of operations that official records would never acknowledge, the lesson remained clear. Heroes don't always announce themselves, they just do the work, carry the weight, and keep moving forward regardless of whether anyone notices. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.